Hello, we're going to get started in just a minute. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and slides will be shared. Your phone line is muted. Welcome again. My name is Leslie Gabay Swanston. I'm the Director of Program and Systems Quality at the National Summer Learning Association. Welcome to our webinar on key provisions in the COVID-19 response bill. Before we get started, here's an overview of our discussion today. First, I'll show a little bit about NSLA for those who are unfamiliar before we hear from our expert panel. In preparing for this webinar, we wanted to make sure our panelists were able to answer as many questions that were on the tops of most people's minds. So rather than try to do a live Q&A answer period, we're going to go through some of the questions that were submitted through the registration process. We think that this will allow us to get more of the questions. Then after that, we will wrap up with some announcements about upcoming events, webinars, and how we will follow up on this particular topic area. The National Summer Learning Association is the only national nonprofit exclusively focused on addressing the achievement and opportunity gaps by increasing access to summer learning opportunities. NSLA's goal is to increase nationwide the number of high-quality summer learning programs. To achieve this goal, NSLA recognizes and disseminates what works, offers expertise and support for programs and communities, and advocates for summer learning as a solution to equity and excellence in education. NSLA's work is driven by the belief that all children and youth deserve high-quality summer learning experiences that will help them succeed in college, career, and life. Core to our work is the recognition that high-quality summer learning programs work and have been shown to improve reading and math skills, school attachment, motivation, and relationships with adults and peers. We know that summer is a time of great inequity for young people, and we believe that promoting and supporting summer opportunities is a way to address this. This goes beyond the summer learning that's in our name. We want to see programs and communities addressing access to other resources like meals and youth jobs. Summer is a time for innovation and exploration. Without some of the constraints of the school year, kids are able to try different ways of learning, interact with other adults and peers that they might not otherwise. It's also a time for innovation for adults, whether that's opportunities for professional development, trying out new teaching methods, or exploring new partnerships. I'm happy to be joined today by three experts on educational policy and legislation. Allie Bernstein is Vice President of the Bernstein Strategy Group, a full-service education government relations firm that represents nonprofits and companies in the education space. At the federal level, Allie focuses on federal appropriations, K-12 policy, and higher education legislation. Additionally, she works with BSG's clients to organize and arrange key educational grassroots events such as lobby days, press events, and Hill briefings. Allie is the Executive Director of the Title IV-A Coalition, which NSLA is a member of, and an active member of Women in Government Relations, and served on the Committee for Education Funding Board of Directors from 2015 to 2018. In 2017, Allie graduated from the Institute for Educational Leadership, Washington, D.C. Education Policy Fellowship Program. She earned her bachelor's degree from Florida State University and her JD from Pack Law School in New York. Sage Learn joined the Boys and Girls Clubs of America in February 2015 and is responsible for providing ongoing leadership on federal issues for Boys and Girls Clubs of America, including planning and implementation of work related to BGCA policies and advocacy efforts. Her portfolio includes, but is not limited to, youth work readiness, education, health, nutrition, safety, character development, and Native issues. She has 16 years of government relations experience prior to BGCA, working as government affairs manager with the National Recreation and Park Association. Sage also worked as a consultant on government relations issues that relate to health and fitness, spent 6 years working for Nike government relations, and initially moved to Washington, D.C. to work for Senator Ron Wyden. Sage has a Bachelor of Science in Political Science from Portland State University. Eric Peterson joined the After School Alliance in July 2008 and coordinates and advances the After School Alliance's policy efforts at the federal level by helping develop policy goals and implementing strategies that advance access to quality after-school programs for all. Eric works to build and strengthen relationships with policymakers and allied organizations to increase public support and funding for quality before school, after school, and summer learning programs. Prior to coming to the After School Alliance, Eric worked for the School Nutrition Association in the Washington, D.C. area as both an AmeriCorps Vista and staff for the Sustainable Food Center in Austin, Texas. He received his master's in public affairs from the LBJ School at the University of Texas and a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University. And with that, I will turn things over to Allie to get us started with an overview of the CARES Act.
Awesome. Okay, so hi everyone. The panelists and I are going to turn our cameras off, and then we'll walk through a bunch of wonky policy and hope that it is helpful for you guys, and then we will go over some questions at the end. It's nice to meet everyone, and thanks for so many of you for being on. We hope that this is helpful, and we'll see you on the other side. Okay, so I just wanted to give you, before we get into the nuts and bolts of things, some background on Congress's response to the COVID-19 bills in hopes that this information helps you guys all navigate these uncertain times. We know a lot of organizations are getting a ton of information right now. And so we just wanted to take this opportunity to really walk you through some wonky policy. So before we get into the CARES Act, I just wanted to give you a quick background on Congress's response to the other two bills. So in order to address the economic fallout from COVID-19, Congress passed a few bills already to provide emergency relief for families, businesses, education systems, and the workforce. The first two bills were passed very quickly and included emergency funds for immediate needs like extended paid leave and school meal flexibility. But then this third package, which is what we are referring to as the CARES Act, is a much larger emergency funding package and is the bulk of what we are going to be talking about today. So again, before I get into the nuts and bolts of the CARES Act, a few things to keep in mind to help put this bill in context. This is an emergency supplemental bill, which means it is additional funding provided outside of the normal appropriations process, which is the process that Congress used to fund most government programs. And as far as we know, Congress does still plan to move through the appropriations process for fiscal year 2021, but there has been little movement on that given their focus on getting emergency funding out to states and districts. So when we are talking about this emergency funding, I just want you all to know that, again, this is outside the normal appropriations process. Okay, so moving right into this first slide. So the CARES Act, which is called the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES for short, was enacted on March 27th, 2020, so very recently, and provides $2 trillion in emergency stimulus funding to, again, like I said, address the immediate financial needs of families, businesses, and the education system amidst the economic fallout from COVID-19. I will note that there are plans for Congress to pass some additional stimulus packages that don't address the immediate needs and are more long-term stimulus, but this is just for the immediate needs. Leslie, if you want to move us to the next slide. Okay, so I know what you're all here to learn about is mostly the K-12 funding and the OST programmatic funding. So I will explain that the CARES Act includes $30.75 billion in an education stabilization fund that would run through the Department of Education to the states. So the funding breaks down in this way. So again, that 30 billion is the overall pot, and then there's three different ways that that breaks out. So the first pot is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which gives governors flexibility to apply for these funds and use them in a wide range of allowable uses, and is pretty much unfettered flexibility at the state level to use it on education. Then the next pot is sort of that K-12 pot, which is 13.5 billion, which, just to put it in perspective, it sounds like a lot, but is not a great deal of money given it is less than 1 year's amount of Title I funding. And that is supposed to flow to districts to be used on, again, a very flexible, wide range of allowable uses, including OST programs, and in accordance with other ESSA programs that are already on the books. And then the 14.23 billion left over is for higher education funding. So the allocations to the states must be made under the following formula, which is very similar to the Title I formula. So this is essentially something that happens at the Department of Education. They run the funds through their Title I formula, which is essentially 60% of those funds, based on the population of students aged 5 through 24, and then 40% on the number of Title I children. And so those funds are all going to flow through these three different pots in that manner. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so the big question that everybody is asking is, how do the states, SEAs and LEAs get these funds? So the CARES Act actually includes a timeline. So within 30 days of the date of enactment of this law, which was March 27th, the Secretary of Education has to publish a notice of intent for applications. So basically a form in which the governors and SEAs can apply to receive these funds. There are two different processes for each. I will note that as of today, the applications for governors to apply has been announced by the Department of Education. Leslie, if you could move us to the next slide, please. Okay, so looking at this, so for the governors, again, I just wanted to outline very quickly what the steps are. I will say there's a sense of urgency, at least with the governor's fund, that there is not with the regular general K through 12 fund. So within 30 days, as I mentioned, the secretary has to publish the application, which did happen today within that 30 days. The time sensitive piece here is this step 2, where governors do have 30 days to apply. That is going to move very quickly, but as you know, the last few weeks have unfolded, we know that governors have already been planning on how they would use this federal funding. And so we will probably see in the next week or two a whole host of governors apply for this pot of money, which again, as I said, can be used very flexibly. And then again, to keep the ball rolling, the Secretary of Education has to approve the funds within 30 days or deny, but I can't imagine, given the rhetoric that has been coming out of the department, that any state would be denied these funds. So again, just that note there, the governors do need to apply within 30 days. However, and we've been getting a lot of questions about this, they do not need to subgrant all of that or spend it within 30 days. They actually have more time in the law to spend the money. So there was a lot of questions around, oh my gosh, we need to spend all this money in 30 days. No, it's just that the governors actually need to apply for those funds from the department within the 30 days. So I just wanted to make that very clear for folks. Okay, yes, next slide, thank you. Okay, so moving on to the K through 12 fund. So this again really applies to the state education agencies, SEAs, and the local education agencies, LEAs. Very similar process, except not as time sensitive. So we've already, we're waiting on step 1 to happen actually. So we saw the governor's fund application come out, but we have not yet seen the K through 12 fund applications. So again, within 30 days from March 27th, the time is really ticking here on the Department of Education to publish the application. And then we will move right into step 2. The SEAs should be applying for these funds, and then, but there is not a sense of urgency like there is with the governor's fund. The SEAs have more time here to actually apply for these funds, but the state entity does not, like I said, have to apply within 30 days. However, once that state entity does actually apply for these funds, the secretary has 30 days to approve that. So the Secretary of Education cannot sit on an application for more than 30 days. It has to get back to that agency within that time frame. So I think here is where we'll see, a difference of how quickly states move to apply for these funds and how quickly they then subgrant out those funds. And then the third step is once the states have applied for those funds and presumably been granted those funds, the states and districts have to use these funds by September 2021, so a year from now. Otherwise, the funds must be returned to the federal government. But given, obviously, the economic hardships as a result of COVID-19, it is presumed that with that only $13.5 billion, that those funds will get used very rapidly. And again, most of these funds are meant to go directly to the local education agencies to be able to use in a manner in which is unique to their needs. This is really a local control pot of money. So again, 90% of those funds should be going directly to the LEAs. And there are, a couple of reservations that can be made at the state and LEA level to implement some administration and technical assistance activities. Okay, moving on. So you guys might be hearing a lot about Waiver Authority, and there is some confusion around what the CARES Act granted in terms of blanket waiver authority versus what the Every Student Succeeds Act has. So I'm just going to take a second to walk you guys through this because this is another area in which we're getting a lot of questions. So the CARES Act granted blanket waiver authority to states, essentially waiving the assessment and reporting requirements. What that means is that CARES granted the secretary more authority than what was previously in the Every Student Succeeds Act to essentially say that given that schools are shut down and closed, we are not going to require you to go through a full waiver authority application to waive assessments. So they're essentially giving the states a free pass to say you don't have to do assessments and certain reporting requirements, obviously, because that isn't really possible when the majority of the nation's schools are closed. So that is what the CARES Act granted. However, there is additional waiver authority granted within the Every Student Succeeds Act. And Leslie, if you move to the next slide. I just wanted to outline this. There's a lot of jargon here, but this is actually just referring to other pieces of the Every Student Succeeds Act in which districts and states can apply for waivers for. So the department issued streamlined a waiver process to provide additional flexibility to use the FY19 funds and 20 funds that are currently already at the district level, as well as the emergency supplemental funding that's coming down the pipeline for programs within the Every Student Succeeds Act. So what you're looking at here is essentially the notice from the education department about which programs districts can receive flexibility from. And what I want to point out here is that a lot of the flexibility that districts are looking to use is particularly around rolling over funds and certain certain allocation requirements. So specifically within things like Title IV, the Student Succeeds, the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grant Program, which requires 20%, 20%, and 60%. 20% on mental health services, 20% on safe and healthy students, and 60% on education technology, or all of those. And so there's a lot of different programs in ESSA that have those types of funding specificities that these waivers essentially allow the Department of Education to waive for districts so that they can use the funds in a much more flexible way. And again, that is only for funds pertaining to this school year and the CARES Act. It is not a waiver for funds that would be coming down the pipeline for the next school year. It is just a one-time waiver, again, to meet the needs as things are, drastically changing at the district level. And again, there's a lot of jargon there, but it is generally referring to things like Title IV-A, and then of course some additional flexibility, which Eric will talk about in Part B of Title IV. And again, like Title I, where you can only spend, or you can only carry over 15% of your Title I funds into the next year. Those are the kinds of waivers that districts are looking to apply for. Okay. And then again, this is just another example of all of the different programs in ESSA that the department is saying that districts can apply for. Now, I will note that it is not a blanket waiver. Districts actually have to proactively apply for these waivers. So remember, this is different than what CARES provided. CARES provided blanket waiver authority to allow districts and states not to do assessments, but anything else outside of what was explicitly authorized in CARES has to be proactively applied for by the districts and the states. And then one other one to note, sorry, before we get into Eric's slide, go back, Leslie, one more piece on that. Is I wanted you guys to understand that the other piece is that waiver flexibility in terms of the definition of professional development. In the law, ESSA defines PD, and there's a long definition for what professional development is, but this waiver was specifically to address making sure that providers, including OST providers, had the ability to utilize funds to provide professional development for online learning as these programs seek to go virtual. And so that was something that the department felt would really provide districts with additional flexibility on. And with that, we'll turn it over to Eric.
Thank you, Allie. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great, thank you. So thanks, Allie, and good afternoon, everybody. So continuing on that, so in addition to the funds that Allie was talking about that are new and available through the CARES Act, of which for the Elementary and Secondary Education Relief Fund, one of the allowable uses mentioned in the law is for after school or summer learning purposes. But in addition to those funds, there is, of course, existing funding that can be used for summer learning this summer, as well as programs going into the fall and out of school time. And that is the 21st Century Community Learning Centers, and many of you are familiar with that and have already received or have in the past received those funds. But as a quick refresher, this is a program also authorized in the Every Student Succeeds Act. It's Title IV, Part B, about 10,000 plus sites around the country that are funded through this, and the current funding is $1.25 billion. So as Ali mentioned, part of the waiver flexibility does that states are able to take advantage of as a result of the current pandemic include some flexibility for 21st Century Community Learning Center, specifically allowing them, state education agencies, to opt in to roll funds over that normally would have been spent in this current fiscal year, or this current school year rather, the 1920 school year, to be able to use them into next school year. Normally, they would have to seek special permission to be able to roll those funds over or return those to the department. And this, by checking that waiver box for Title IV Part B or 21st Century Community Learning Centers, it allows them additional flexibility. It is up to the state, however, if they want to allow individual 21st Century Community Learning Center grantees to be able to roll their funds that normally would have been spent this year that maybe are not all being utilized given the current situation to be able to use in the summer or into the fall. And we're seeing different states doing that. I'll get into that in a second. In terms of 21st Century Community Learning Centers, there's no official guidance yet from the U.S. Department of Education. They have made it clear that they're continuing to work on that and working through channels, and eventually that will come out. They have, however, indicated that states can and should waive their own waive state requirements and use the flexibilities that are within the program already to be able to support local 21st century grantees on the ground, whether they're school district run programs or community-based organizations or others. And that includes, in sort of their example, an FAQ of theirs is that states can allow 21st century grantees programs to be reimbursed based on measures other than a program attendance. So use their levels pre-closure, pre-school closure, or on how many students were enrolled at the beginning of the student year as a way to base their reimbursement in order to be able to continue to pay staff. Next slide. So in absence of federal guidance so far or direction or FAQ on 21st Century Community Learning Centers, states have gone ahead and issued their own guidance. It varies dramatically from state to state. And you can see a map here. It's about 30 states that have posted such guidance and or made it available to grantees. It's a different situation for some of the states that are still in gray. Most of those seem to be working one-on-one with grantees to sort of troubleshoot and figure out how to support them without posting sort of a blanket guidance or FAQs or direction. And at least 2 states there in blue have addressed after-school programs from the state education agency, but not specific to 21st century. Next slide, we'll get into sort of what that state level guidance looks like. And this again is for the current situation where schools are closed this spring. And it will be interesting to see as we evolve into the summer what that looks like, whether programs will be able to open as planned and do in-person programming this summer using the 21st century funds, or most likely, at least in some communities, they will continue to have closures and therefore won't be able to bring students in, but will be doing online or virtual programming as programs are doing now. So again, for those 30 states, they're allowing employees to continue to be paid, programs to continue to be reimbursed, and then they're defining what those allowable work activities for reimbursement are. Again, varies from state to state. So the most common ones are sort of the online or virtual programming, and then professional development for staff. So using things like the Department of Ed's U for Youth online professional development platform, another state-run or other private available professional development and quality tools, planning resources, as activities for staff to continue to work. We've also seen in some states support and allowance of 21st century funds to do meal distribution and or delivery or pickup for parents. And we've also seen a lot of family engagement, parent engagement support work from 21st century programs. So particularly supporting parents who are now maybe struggling with working with their young people, their children at home around homework help, around figuring out the technology that some schools are using for virtual learning, and really having 21st century program and summer, soon to be hopefully summer program staff working through with parents and providing them support that they need to be able to support their students. And then also, of course, also doing virtual programming, directly supporting students. And again, what that looks like at the local level depends on the program, but we've seen everything from sort of problem solving type things with Legos, other, using activities or materials around the house to do STEM experiments, and really trying to supplement and complement the online learning and or worksheets or modules that students are doing through virtual school, to be able to, again, just like in the in-person after school and summer space, trying to be hands-on and engaging and reinforce what the virtual classroom activities are. Let's go to the next slide. So in addition to sort of the allowable activities, some states have also reduced some of the requirements around reporting. They're again waiting for the Department of Ed for some more direction on that, but right now states are sort of easing up a little bit on monitoring requirements and often doing sort of virtual site visits where they can as well in this current situation. The other big question that we've been getting on 21st Century, which certainly applies for the summer as well, is the request for proposal deadlines. Most states, although it's not required, it's already during the spring. So now would be doing their state level competitions for local schools, community-based organizations, other eligible entities to apply for 21st Century funds. Some states have continued on those processes and their current deadlines, but I'd say the majority who had competitions in the works or posted have extended those deadlines by a month or 6 weeks, and some states have canceled those altogether for now and are going to plan to repost them either later this year, summer or fall, and in those cases, most states are looking at extending current grantees by a year. But if you're a grantee and have those kinds of questions, certainly reach out and contact your state education agency, your 21st Century office, to see how they plan to address that. There is flexibility in 21st Century to do automatic renewals and or to extend a grant by an extra year. So that flexibility does exist without the Department of Ed specifically giving that, that direction. And then next piece that I wanted to address before I hand it over to Sage is the nutrition side. So in addition to programs doing virtual learning, we're seeing this spring and going into summer, the role of community-based organizations and school districts in really providing meals to families. As folks know, about 22 million students are eligible for and receive free and reduced price meals during the school year. With school out, that leaves 22 million students who normally would rely on schools for breakfast and lunch, and a smaller number, but still a good number, around 10 million, that would rely on after-school snacks or after-school meals, no longer able to access those. So while student school nutrition programs and food banks, I'd say, are two key partners in getting those meals out, there is the flexibility for providers, after-school summer providers, to provide meals as well. And so there's a number of waivers through the Family First Coronavirus Response Act that passed back March 18th, and then the CARES Act that I mentioned that just passed late March, in addition to existing USDA Waiver Authority that allows programs and or schools to use both the summer food program and the child and adult care feeding program at-risk after-school meal program, mouthful, to be able to offer meals. And so some of the waivers have include not requiring, congregate meal service, so being able to take meals off site, meal service time flexibility, so not having to serve breakfast during breakfast time and lunch during lunchtime. They've waived monitoring of sites. They've allowed 2 meals or a meal and a snack per day, and allowing families to pick up multiple meals at once, so like a week's worth of meals. That was a waiver. And then also that parents don't have to have children with them. Children don't have to be present to pick up the meals, which, given everything going on, is a good flexibility as well. And then for at-risk after-school meals, there's the requirement that activity or enrichment take place with the meals. That's been waived, obviously, as well, although programs are distributing activities when parents pick up meals as well. And then the nutrition standard piece, the big issue here has been around food availability to meet the meal pattern requirements, particularly access to milk in some parts of the country where there's a shortage of being able to get milk for meals, which is required for meal reimbursement, been waived as well. And then there are some new flexibilities in nutrition that just came out this week that we wanted to mention real quick. And these, again, will apply for this summer as well, presumably. It clarifies that meals can also be served on the weekends and during spring breaks or any other, in addition to regular school closures, that child and adult care feeding programs can now also do meals on multiple days. That had been a question. And then a key piece that we've been hearing and now finally have confirmation of is that a school could partner with a community-based organization and run both the summer feeding program and CACFP at the same time, which would allow 2 meals under CACFP and a meal and a snack under CSCFB. So essentially 3 meals and a snack for families that need those. And then also confirmation around home delivery. Additionally, in a lot of states, only schools can do that. Now, nonprofit sponsors or community-based organizations can do that as well, although definitely check with your state agency on how they're doing that, because there are some qualifications to that as well. And then finally, that bulk food items can be now provided, not just sort of the unit of a meal. That was a lot, I realize, and we're happy to follow up with resources on that, and definitely check out the USDA Food Nutrition Service. They have all those memos listed for the exact policy language on those. Last thing I'm going to say, and before I hand it over to Sage, was around the this USDA site, the Meals for Kids site, which you may be familiar with from the summer, but they have that up and running now. And essentially it allows families to find where meals are being provided in their community, either drop off or pick up or sort of drive-through models. But I've mentioned that because if you're a local provider, especially for the summer, and you're interested in providing meals with learning, with activities, either virtually, remotely, in some other way, checking out your local zip code, your community, to see who is currently providing meals, and if they are schools, if they're not going to be doing it this summer, and that there'll be a gap in access to meals. This is a key area that can be filled, and or if schools are and other providers are continuing or planning to continue with meal service into the summer, reaching out to them to see if there's a way to partner on activities and or to be able to partner on meal service. So I wanted to throw up that site as well, so you can get a sense of what the landscape looks like, if you don't already know, in your community. And with that, I believe I will hand it over to Sage to talk a little bit on the Child Care Development Block Grant.
Great, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you. Thanks, Sage.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Eric, Allie, and Leslie, and everyone for taking time to join the call amidst all the incredible work I know you guys are doing to serve communities during this crisis. I'm going to talk a little bit about Child Care Development Block Grants, or also called CCDBG. As some of you may know, there was an additional $3.5 billion in funding for CCDBG, along with some flexibilities around it. For allowances, the funding can be used to address critical childcare needs to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. Some of the new flexibilities that were allowed inside the CARES Act on how the funding can be utilized include enables the income eligibility of the youth served for the program to be waived, meaning organizations can provide childcare assistance to healthcare sector employees, emergency responders, sanitation workers, and other workers deemed essential during the response to coronavirus, regardless of their income. Additionally, services can be provided for school-age children in addition to early childhood. New entities that were not previously receiving funding prior to the crisis are eligible and can apply. Funding can be used for deep cleaning and sanitization of facilities and other related activities that are necessary to maintain or resume the operations of those programs. Funds are also exempted from the quality and direct service spending requirements. Normally 70% of funds to states would be used for direct services and 30% for quality. It currently does not apply. As usual for CCDBG funding, it will go through the state agencies, and states are given authority on issues like child care licensing waivers. So for something pertaining to that, you would want to weigh in with your state agency. Some states are making additional allowances in early conversations some of our folks have seen. The Department of Health and Human Services will make the allocations to each state in the same proportion as CCDBG funds are generally allocated. However, the timeframe for funding remains to be seen. The agencies were given 30 days to implement, and it will go out to the states, and the states will have 30 days to award funding. On our end, we're continuing to watch for timing so that we can let folks know, and additional guidance will be released. While exact timing remains to be seen, we encourage everyone to start those conversations with the state agencies as early as possible. I think getting in the door so that you have those conversations, if you are able to provide emergency childcare services, is going to help you as soon as the funding does go out. The Federal Office of Child Care has also released COVID-specific guidance to the field, allowing states discretion. Includes information such as states can provide continued payments and assistance to providers in the case of decreased enrollment or closures. This is for current grantees, and to ensure that they can remain open or reopen as appropriate. Next slide. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Paycheck Protection Program. This is something we've heard a lot of questions from our Boys and Girls Clubs on. This is a new program under SBA. It was a new $350 billion lending program under small business loans called Paycheck Protection Program, which provides funding for emergency loans to nonprofits and small businesses. Nonprofits were newly included inside of this. These loans can cover costs of payroll and operations and allows the loans may be forgiven if certain criteria are met. We know there's been a lot of questions about how this works, and because the lawmaking happened so rapidly in response to the crisis, there are still a lot of gray areas, and Treasury has been updating guidance almost on a daily basis after it was passed. So where there are still questions, always recommend you can send questions to Treasury or ask your lenders. But I'll cover a high-level overview of the program on what we know so far. The criteria for the loans are businesses and nonprofits with no more than 500 employees are eligible. Loan applications can be submitted to any existing Small Business Administration lender. Loans can be used to cover such items as payroll costs, healthcare benefits, employee salaries, although the salaries are capped at $100,000, mortgage interest, rent, and utilities. The maximum loan amount is $10 million, or 2.5 times the borrower's average monthly payroll last year. All payments on principal, interest, and fees will be automatically deferred for 6 months from the date of the loan. Borrowers that retain their staff and maintain wages up until June 30th, 2020 will qualify for loan for forgiveness. This is to really aim at employee retention, encouraging employee retention. Only the portion of the loan used to cover payroll, mortgage interest, rent, and utilities and other debt obligations incurred over an 8-week period are eligible to be forgiven. To encourage employers to rehire employees that have already been laid off due to the COVID crisis, borrowers that rehire those workers previously laid off will not be penalized for having a reduced payroll at the beginning of the period, and the payroll costs of any such employees are eligible for loan forgiveness. The amount of forgiveness of the loan depends on the payroll costs over the 8-week period, and that 8-week period begins on the date of the first disbursement. Well, this funding has rapidly been allocated, and we have been hearing that it will run out soon. There is conversations in Congress for new funding in the next package. We think there will likely be something. Both the administration, Democrats and Republicans, all want to see a plus up of this program. Although what else would be in the next package, there continue to be disagreements over. So timing remains to be seen at this point. But would encourage folks that are interested in this program, talk to your lenders right away. The existing funds are moving out rapidly, so get in the door and start having conversations as soon as you can. Next slide. Next, I want to talk a little bit as we look forward with the next stimulus packages, whether there is a smaller package, CARES 2.1 or 2.5, it's been called a few different things, or a larger package that happens further down the road. There has been a group of out-of-school time folks that have been working together. And it's really in response to what we've heard as the greatest need from communities and the youth, especially in the out-of-school time space, and what's going to benefit club organizations as they reopen their doors or continue to serve youth. There is a joint letter that there is about 25 groups signed on to, and encourage more folks to add their name to it. We know this, the more voices we have, the stronger we are as we talk to folks on the Hill. I want to talk a little bit about what some of those asks are. And again, this has really been in response from the different groups. It's folks like YMCA, National Summer Learning Association, After School Alliance, Boys and Girls Clubs of America that are part of this group. One of the big pieces is $10 billion for recovery funding for youth serving nonprofits during the out-of-school time to offset costs, lost program and fundraising revenue. $100 million for youth workforce readiness supports to help offset the skills gap and prepare youth for summer jobs. We know we'll be combating a skills gap to get youth back on track. track and hopefully preparing them so that they can get those summer jobs. Creating more guidance at the national level for 21st century programs, as Eric talked about. A lot of the authority has been state by state on where those flexibilities are, but having a national criteria so that programs could be have funding based on enrollment, not attendance, or get reimbursed for virtual programming and staff training. Also for increased funding for 21st century, an additional $500 million for this summer. Again, knowing we'll be facing a skills gap as schools have been out and youth are trying to catch up. Additionally, new allowances under the USDA meal programs. Well, a lot of organizations are providing the takeaway meals and utilizing the flexibilities that Erica talked about. We continue to see some areas where there's more need, including participating in the USDA programs to deliver meals to youth that aren't able to get to the clubs, or for clubs that are, organizations that aren't open, as well as providing a third meal this summer, knowing that we will be addressing some food insecurity coming out of this. The last piece that we're advocating for is additional funding, $250 million for youth serving programs to utilize trauma-informed care training and program implementation, knowing that there will be increased adverse childhood experiences as we come out of this COVID crisis. And would love to hear from groups that are interested in joining the letter, as well as any feedback. Again, I think the more voices we have, the stronger we are together. And with that, I will turn it back over to Allie.
Hey guys, so Leslie, I think I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yes, so as I mentioned at the beginning of our webinar, we're going to have our panel answer some pre-submitted questions. This won't be the only opportunity for you all to ask questions. We'll continue this conversation in the future. But these are questions that our panel probably covered most of this in their presentations, but these are questions that were most frequently asked, and so we want to make sure that we reiterate the responses to these questions. So Allie, the first question is for you. Are these grant funds or loans?
So when we're talking about the governor's funds and the K-12 funds, those are grant funds. So those do not need to be repaid back to the federal government.
And how can organizations go about soliciting for education stimulus funding that is not directly designated to school districts?
So again, I mean, I think that the majority of these funds are going to the district, so 90% of those funds will be. But if you're an organization that doesn't receive money from the district, I definitely encourage all of the providers and all of the organizations to be leveraging other funds at these times, including, you know, additional foundation funding and any other relief funding. But for the most part, what we're talking about here is leveraging funds that the districts already have, and sometimes the LEAs do sub-grant out those funds. And the same is true for the COVID-19 CARES Act relief funding. So once 90% of that funds, or of those funds are in the LEA's hands, they then of course can sub-grant that out to other programs. But again, the most of that is for K-12, and they have great flexibility under both CARES and ESSA to make sub-grants to organizations that are, you know, doing other things beyond just, you know, what we consider traditional K-12 education. And again, that might be sub-granting out for providing professional development to help providers learn how to adequately use technology to engage in learning, whether that's summer learning or continuous learning, getting programs that were in person to now be virtual. So I definitely encourage the providers to really think about how they can leverage these funds for a wide array of uses beyond what we traditionally have been using them for. And I think you're going to see a lot of organizations thinking very differently about how to approach their districts to use these funds to make sure that kids are still learning.
Great. Sage, the question for you. Are there any other opportunities or grants for nonprofits other than the Paycheck Protection Plan? Can you apply for both the PPP and economic injury disaster loan?
My understanding is you can apply for both, but not for the same purpose. You would have to qualify different criteria under the loans.
Thank you. Next, we have some questions about who's eligible to receive funds. Allie, can you talk again about which funds can be used by the state education agencies and local education agencies for activities during summer learning program?
So are we talking about specific activities or, because again, there's a wide array of entities that would be eligible for the funds, but the main entities are the SEAs and the LEAs. And again, a big majority of those funds, and we're talking about the K-12 piece. The governors piece, once the governors get their money, they have, again, a wide range of flexibility of how they will sub-grant out those funds. But the LEAs are the primary grantees of the K-12 pot. And then from there, beneficiaries that, implement programs under the Every Student Succeeds Act are generally still available to receive those funds. So for instance, under Title IV-A, libraries, and I know we've been getting a lot of questions as to whether libraries are eligible for the funds. Yes, because under ESSA, Title IV Part A, the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grant, libraries are eligible for those funds. And so under the CARES Act funding that goes to the districts, they still would be eligible. But again, this is about making the case to your district leaders about why those funds should be spent on these particular activities.
Sage, is there a part of the act that's specified towards daycare or childcare programs? I think you mentioned that earlier.
Yep, the child care development block grants. And the new funding would be in particular for childcare where they've remained open during the crisis and they're serving emergency workers.
And I think we touched on earlier about virtual learning opportunities. Can some of these funds be used to provide technology to students, Allie?
Yes, so both the CARES Act funding and the Title IV Part A, as well as some Title I funds obviously can be used to support online learning. And then the CARES Act specifically included a catch-all in addition to the online learning language that was included in the provisions to purchase technology or provide online learning professional development. So both the CARES Act and already existing funnels within the Every Student Succeeds Act, specifically Title IV Part A. And again, when I was mentioning that waiver authority, one of the restrictions on the Title IV-A funding is that there's a 15% cap on purchasing technology. But under this scenario, if a state were to apply for the waiver and say, hey, we actually want to use more of that funding in addition to our CARES funding, but we don't want to abide by that cap, because we're seeing that a majority of our students don't have access to devices. Presumably that state could ask the Department of Education for a waiver to spend more of those funds on the technology piece.
Eric, we had a couple questions about 21st century community learning centers. What are the implications of the federal bill on employment claims made by staff of 21st CCLC programs?
And so On the unemployment piece, there were provisions in a couple of different pieces of federal legislation that responded to the pandemic, in particular in the CARES Act, that does provide some funding, additional funding and additional flexibility to state unemployment offices that extends who is covered under or who is eligible for unemployment payments. The best course of action there's nothing specific to 21st Century, but 21st Century providers, whether they're nonprofits or others, or for-profits or local government that might have run programs, I suggest that the program and or the individual check with your state unemployment insurance program, and they're housed in different agencies and depending on the state. But if you Google for your state unemployment insurance program, there should be they're in the process of implementing from the federal government new provisions so that like we know a lot of 21st Century programs use contracted employee, part-time employees, and others both for the summer and school year for after school. And traditionally those positions are not covered by unemployment insurance, but they are as a result of the flexibility of this law. But states are doing it differently. So I would check with the state unemployment program in your state.
Okay. And can you touch on how school closures will affect assets programming and funding?
So assets is a state level funding stream for older youth in California. Again, every state's different, but in California, they've been, there actually was a executive order from the governor and the state agency there, and Department of Expanded Learning within the California Department of Education have been working on and have recently published guidance around allowing funds, 21st Century funds, assets funds, and also their ACEs funding to be able to support programs now, particularly that are serving children of essential workers, so sort of emergency care programs. It's not required, but there is additional flexibility there. So again, I would point folks to the state agency for more information on how that works. And my understanding is communities are figuring out what kind of programs they need right now and how they'll navigate that in terms of which providers. And that'll probably change as we move into the summer. The current landscape, I'd say this spring with school closures, the out of school time field is just, in my estimation, just sort of trying to figure out their spot and sort of get in the groove. And that obviously will change depending on what happens this summer, if in-person programs are available or allowable in some communities, or if we're going to be looking at virtual again. But I suspect a lot of state agencies are going to have to be flexible with their guidance, and what might have worked this out of school time may not work this summer, or it may, just depending on the situation.
Okay. And Eric, can you quickly touch on if there's any particular focus or set aside for rural communities?
Yes, so most of the funding, in fact, all the funding streams that we talked about today, so the education funding that Ali mentioned, the Child Care Development Block Grant funding, and nonprofit grants that that Sage mentioned, all obviously can be utilized in rural settings and by rural program providers. But for rural specific, the only funding stream really in the CARES Act so far that is focused in on rural is the rural broadband program. So it was $100 million for what's called Reconnect grants for rural communities to be able to address broadband access, and obviously from an education perspective and program support, programming perspective, particularly with virtual programming, it's incredibly important that students and families have access to be able to take advantage of the programming and or education that's being delivered virtually. So my understanding is that funding is in the process of going out to those eligible rural communities. And so there's that piece in terms of, summer learning directly for rural programs, there isn't at this point. However, again, the funding streams that were mentioned can be used in rural communities as well. And so those small rural school districts, will be getting funding through through the Elementary and Secondary Education Relief Fund as well. And to the point really quick on the questions, we've seen a lot on the chat box around how can nonprofits access those funds. There isn't an application process per se for that. As Ali mentioned, the money goes to the school districts, but then as a nonprofit or a local organization, if you are able to and have a track record of providing programming, reach out now, I would say, sooner, now and in the future, to your local school district leadership, and talk about partnerships to be able to provide, because there's, it's going to be all hands on deck, I think, this summer and into next fall, to be able to address the learning loss that we know is occurring, and to be able to provide engaging programming for young people who are going through school closures now.
Okay, thank you. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. We do see all your questions and being posted in the chat box. So we're capturing all of that. Our plan is to continue to follow up both with the what develops with the new stimulus package, and then also to put together a frequently asked questions documents to share with you all. In addition to that, we have a one-pager overview that I just posted in the chat box, a link to that in the chat box, that gives an additional overview of some of the things that we talked about today. I will be sharing that out along with a link to the recording, the link to that one-pager, a PDF of these slides, and then also a form for national organizations if they want to help sign on to this letter that Sage spoke about, and to also capture any additional questions you have going forward. This is definitely not the last conversation we're going to have about this. But just to wrap up with some final announcements, and thank you again to our panelists, Ali, Sage, Eric, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you all for your great questions that you submitted. I just want to give you guys a reminder that National Summer Learning Week is going to be still happening this year. It might be virtual, but it will be July 6th to the 11th. So this will be another opportunity to share what you're doing during the summer. We're going to be having resources that are going to be coming out leading up to that week as well. So you can learn more about Summer Learning Week on our website. We are still in the works to plan and have our national conference in Washington, D.C., November 16th to the 18th. As of now, we're still going to be in person. We are in the midst of collecting submissions for proposals for workshops. They are due next Wednesday, April 22nd, and our early bird registration is up and open on our website until May 31st. This webinar is part of a series of webinars that we're putting together on different topics. So we will be having other webinars coming up on other topics such as virtual learning, arts programs, sports programs. So look out for announcements about that. If you're not following us on social media, be sure to follow us so you get the latest updates and announcements. So with that, I'll just say thank you. Look forward to speaking to you all again, and look out for the follow-up information and announcements. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.